The morning of October 25, 1944, off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines. At 06:45 hours, a single Grumman Avenger torpedo bomber from Composite Squadron VC-65 broke through the low clouds on a routine anti-submarine patrol. Ensign William C. Brooks, the pilot, expected nothing more than empty ocean and the monotonous hum of his Wright Cyclone engine. What he saw instead made his blood freeze. Stretched across the northwestern horizon, emerging from the darkness like iron ghosts, was the most powerful surface fleet the Imperial Japanese Navy could still muster. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers, and at the center of this armada, the massive pagoda mast of the battleship Yamato, the largest warship ever built, displacing 72,000 tons and armed with 9 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing more than a small car over 26 miles. Brooks didn't hesitate. He yanked his aircraft into a sharp turn, throttled to the firewall, and screamed into his radio. Enemy surface force of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers sighted 20 miles northwest of your task group and closing at 30 knots. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Below him, steaming in a lazy circular formation off Samar, was Taffy 3, not a battle fleet, not even a proper carrier task force. Taffy 3 was a unit of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. 16 ships in total, designed not for fleet engagement, but for supporting amphibious landings and hunting submarines. The escort carriers Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Callinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambia Bay were converted merchant hulls with wooden flight decks. They displaced less than 8,000 tons each. Their maximum speed was 17 knots, barely half what the Japanese fleet could achieve. Their armament consisted of a single 5-inch gun mounted on the stern, useful primarily for signalling and morale. They carried aircraft, yes, but these were Grumman Wildcats and Avengers configured with depth charges and small bombs for anti-submarine work, not armor-piercing weapons designed to penetrate battleship steel. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were slightly better armed, but their torpedoes and 5-inch guns were laughably inadequate against capital ships armored to withstand 16-inch naval rifles. The men aboard Taffy 3 had spent the previous days supporting the American landings on Leyte. They had launched strikes against Japanese positions ashore, provided air cover for transport ships, and dealt with the routine tedium of wartime operations far from the main battle. Most assumed the real fighting was happening elsewhere. Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet, with its fast carriers and modern battleships, was supposed to be guarding the northern approaches. Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's Seventh Fleet, with its battleships and cruisers, was covering the Leyte Gulf to the south. Taffy 3, designated Task Unit 77.4.3, was exactly where escort carriers were supposed to be, safely behind the front lines, performing unglamorous but necessary support work. Nobody expected them to fight a surface engagement. Nobody had trained them for it. Nobody had given them the weapons for it. When Brooks' message came through, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, commander of Taffy 3 aboard the Fanshawe Bay, initially thought it was a mistake. Perhaps Brooks had spotted American ships and misidentified them in the pre-dawn light. Perhaps it was Halsey's fleet, steaming south after engaging Japanese carriers to the north. But within minutes, lookouts on the escort carriers themselves began reporting pagoda masts on the horizon, then shell splashes. Enormous geysers of water, dyed red, yellow, and green by Japanese spotting charges, began erupting around the American ships. The splashes were color-coded, so Japanese gunners could distinguish which ship was firing which salvo, a refinement that spoke to the professionalism and experience of Kurita's fleet. At 06:59, a 14-inch shell from the heavy cruiser Kumano screamed over the Fanshawe Bay's flight deck, missing by less than 100 yards. There was no mistake. The Imperial Japanese Navy's center force, thought to have been crippled by American carrier strikes the previous day, was not only intact, it was right here, right now, and it had caught Taffy 3 completely exposed. To understand the magnitude of what happened next, you must understand what Imperial Japan believed on the morning of October 25, 1944. Not what was true, but what Admiral Takeo Kurita and his commanders thought was true. The Japanese plan for the Battle of Leyte Gulf, designated Shogo Operation No. 1, was predicated on a carefully orchestrated deception. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force, consisting of 4 aircraft carriers with barely any planes aboard, would deliberately expose itself to Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet far to the north. Halsey, the Japanese believed, would take the bait. He would chase Ozawa's carriers with his entire fleet, leaving the approaches to Leyte Gulf undefended. Meanwhile, 2 powerful Japanese surface forces would converge on the invasion beaches from different directions. Admiral Shoji Nishimura's southern force would approach through Surigao Strait. Kurita's center force would transit the San Bernardino Strait under cover of darkness and fall upon the American amphibious shipping at dawn, undefended and helpless. The plan required precise timing, absolute courage, and a willingness to accept devastating losses. But if it succeeded, it would destroy the American invasion fleet, strand General Douglas MacArthur's troops ashore without supplies or reinforcements, and potentially change the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. Kurita's fleet had already endured hell to reach this position. On October 23rd, while transiting the Palawan Passage, American submarines had torpedoed 3 of his heavy cruisers. The Otago, Kurita's flagship, went down so quickly that the admiral barely escaped with his life, swimming through oil-slicked water while his staff drowned around him. The Maya exploded and sank within minutes. The Takao, crippled, had to turn back. On October 24th, while crossing the Sibuyan Sea, Kurita's fleet came under repeated attack from American carrier aircraft. Wave after wave of Helldivers, Avengers, and Hellcats pounded his ships. The super battleship, Musashi, sister ship to the Yamato, absorbed an estimated 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits over the course of 6 hours before finally capsizing and sinking, taking more than 1,000 men with her. Kurita's remaining ships were battered, low on ammunition, and exhausted. At one point, Kurita had actually ordered a temporary withdrawal, convinced his fleet could not survive another day of air attacks. But then the attacks stopped. The American planes disappeared. Kurita received reports, incorrect reports, that his fleet had inflicted significant damage on the American carriers. And critically, he received orders from Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo. Continue the mission. The fate of the Empire depends on your success. Do not withdraw. So Kurita pressed on. His fleet transited San Bernardino Strait after midnight on October 25th, passing through the narrow waters in darkness, expecting at any moment to encounter American forces guarding the passage. But there was nothing. No picket destroyers, no submarines, no radar-equipped PT boats. Halsey had indeed taken the bait. He had steamed north with his entire Third Fleet, chasing Ozawa's empty carriers, and leaving the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. It was an error of monumental proportions, one that would haunt Halsey for the rest of his life. But at that moment, as Kurita's battered fleet emerged into the Philippine Sea and turned south toward Leyte Gulf, the Japanese admiral must have felt the first stirrings of hope. Perhaps the plan would work after all. Perhaps the gods of war had not entirely abandoned Japan. The intelligence Kurita possessed about American forces off Samar was fragmentary and confused. He knew American escort carriers were operating in the area, providing air support for the later landings. He knew these were small, lightly armed ships. He knew they were vulnerable. What he did not know, what he could not know, was the true nature of what he was about to encounter. The American fast carrier task forces, the ones with fleet carriers like Essex and Lexington, operated in groups designated task groups. They were powerful, heavily, defended, built around carriers that could launch 100 aircraft or more, and protected by cruisers, battleships, and screening destroyers. The escort carrier groups, by contrast, were designated task units and nicknamed Taffys. There was Taffy 1 to the south, Taffy 2 in the middle, and Taffy 3 to the north. All three groups operated similar ships, escort carriers and their escorts, 18 ships per group. From a distance, especially in poor visibility, it was difficult to distinguish between a fleet carrier and an escort carrier. Both had flight decks, both launched aircraft. The silhouette was similar enough to create confusion. As Kurita's lookouts spotted the masts and flight decks of Taffy 3 on the horizon, Japanese commanders made a critical assumption. These were not escort carriers. These were fleet carriers. This was not a support unit. This was a fast carrier task group, probably the southern element of Halsey's Third Fleet that had somehow evaded detection. The logic seemed sound. Fleet carriers would be heavily escorted. They would be fast. They would be dangerous. But if Kurita could close the range quickly, if he could get inside the American destroyer screen before the carriers could launch a full strike, if his battleships and cruisers could bring their superior firepower to bear, he might be able to destroy a significant portion of American carrier strength in a single devastating surface engagement. It would be the greatest Japanese naval victory since Midway. It would vindicate the entire Shogo operation. It would prove that Bushido and fighting spirit could still overcome American material superiority. Kurita gave the order at 0658. General attack. All ships attack independently. This was not standard Japanese doctrine. Normally, a fleet admiral would maintain tight tactical control, coordinating his ship's movements to concentrate fire and prevent confusion. But Kurita had reasons for his decision. His fleet was scattered after the night transit through San Bernardino Strait. Radio communications were unreliable after days of battle damage. Most importantly, he believed time was critical. If these were indeed American fleet carriers, they would launch their aircraft within minutes. Every second spent organizing a coordinated attack was a second the Americans could use to get planes into the air. Better to charge immediately, each ship engaging at maximum speed, overwhelming the Americans with sheer audacity and firepower before they could react. The Japanese ships surged forward. The Yamato, with her 9 18-inch guns, was capable of firing shells that weighed more than 3,000 pounds each. The battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each mounting 8 14-inch rifles. The heavy cruisers Haguro, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and Tone, bristling with 8-inch guns and long-lance torpedoes. The light cruisers Yahagi and Noshiro with their rapid-fire 6-inch batteries. 11 destroyers, all charging at flank speed 30 knots or more towards 6 escort carriers that could barely manage 17 knots under ideal conditions. The range was approximately 25 miles when the chase began. At current speeds, the Japanese would overtake the Americans within 90 minutes, probably less. The mathematics were brutally simple. This wasn't going to be a battle. It was going to be an execution. Aboard the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague faced a situation no American naval officer had confronted since the early dark days of 1942. His ships were hopelessly outgunned. They were far too slow to escape. The nearest American heavy surface forces, Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's battleships, were more than 100 miles to the south, having spent the previous night annihilating Admiral Nishimura's southern force in Surigao Strait. They could not possibly arrive in time. Halsey's Third Fleet was more than 300 miles to the north, completely out of position. There would be no rescue, no cavalry charge over the hill. Taffy 3 was on its own. Sprague issued orders with remarkable calm, given the circumstances. All escort carriers were to turn east, directly away from the Japanese fleet, and make maximum speed. All available aircraft were to launch immediately, armed with whatever weapons they had depth charges, high-explosive bombs, machine gun ammunition, anything that might at least harass the Japanese ships. And critically, Sprague ordered his screening vessels, the destroyers Hole, Heerman, and Johnston, along with the destroyer escorts Dennis, John C., Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts to lay smoke and prepare for torpedo attacks. These orders were tantamount to a death sentence for the screening ships. Destroyers and destroyer escorts attacking battleships was suicide. Everyone knew it. But it might buy time. It might create confusion. It might, if they were very lucky and the Japanese were very careless, do some actual damage. The Yamato opened fire at 0703 at a range of approximately 19 miles. Her forward turrets elevated, the massive 18-inch rifles roared, and 6 shells arced across the sky. They missed, but not by much. The splashes were enormous, each one tall enough to be seen from miles away. The other Japanese battleships and cruisers followed suit. Within minutes, the ocean around Taffy 3 was erupting in hundreds of towering geysers, coloured red and yellow and green, the water boiling with near misses and shrapnel. The noise was indescribable. The concussion from shell impacts made the thin hulls of the escort carriers ring like bells. Men below decks, unable to see what was happening, felt the vibrations and knew they were being bracketed by weapons that could vaporize their ship with a single hit. And then, something extraordinary happened. Something that would define the next 2.5 hours, and create one of the most improbable victories in naval history. The Americans started fighting back, not with equivalent weapons, not with any realistic hope of victory, but with a ferocity and tactical creativity that would transform what should have been a massacre into something else entirely. The destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, a Cherokee Indian from Oklahoma, charged directly at the Japanese fleet without waiting for orders. Evans had promised his crew when he took command that he would never retreat from any enemy. He kept his promise. The Johnston raced through its own smoke screen, worked up to flank speed, and aimed straight for the nearest Japanese heavy cruiser, determined to get close enough for a torpedo attack. Behind the Johnston came the Hole and the Heermann. Behind them came the destroyer escorts, smaller and more lightly armed but just as determined. In the air, the aircraft from Taffy 3's escort carriers clawed for altitude with whatever weapons had been loaded on them that morning. Some carried anti-submarine depth charges, useless against ships but launched anyway in the desperate hope they might cause some damage if dropped accurately. Some carried small, high-explosive bombs meant for shore targets. Some carried nothing at all, no bombs, no torpedoes, no rockets, just machine gun ammunition. But they flew toward the Japanese fleet anyway, making dry runs, strafing, doing anything to distract Japanese gunners and disrupt their aim. Pilots who had trained for anti-submarine warfare suddenly found themselves attempting to torpedo bomb battleships. Gunners who had spent months shooting at periscopes and whale pods now aimed at pagoda masts and armoured superstructures. The Japanese lookouts watched this and saw something that did not match their expectations. Fleet carriers did not charge into surface engagements. Fleet carriers retreated. They kept their distance. They used their aircraft as their primary weapons, while their escorting battleships and cruisers provided the heavy firepower. But these American ships were not behaving like fleet carriers. These destroyers were attacking with a recklessness that suggested either insanity or desperation. These aircraft were making runs with completely inappropriate ordnance. And most puzzling of all, these carriers were only making 17 knots. Fleet carriers could manage 30 knots or more. Why were these ships so slow? The confusion began to spread through the Japanese fleet. On the bridge of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita's staff struggled to interpret what they were seeing. The battle was not developing as expected. The American carriers were heading generally east, yes, but also slightly south, angling toward a rain squall visible on the horizon. The destroyers were not screening defensively, they were attacking. The American aircraft were not launching coordinated strikes, they were swarming in from all directions, in small groups, often making individual runs. Communication between Japanese ships was breaking down under the stress of high-speed maneuvering and constant air attack. And critically, nobody on the Japanese side had a clear picture of how many American ships were actually present. Was this one carrier group or two? Were there more American ships beyond the horizon? Where were the American battleships that should be escorting these carriers? At 0724, torpedoes from the destroyer Johnston struck the heavy cruiser Kumano. The Kumano's bow was blown off. The ship slewed to a halt, out of the fight. At 0727, the destroyer Hoel launched torpedoes at the battleship Congo from a range of less than 5 miles, suicidally close, and scored what the American crew believed was a hit, though Japanese records do not confirm this. What is certain is that the Congo turned sharply away to avoid the torpedoes, disrupting the Japanese formation and forcing other ships to maneuver, to avoid collision. The destroyer Heermann charged so close to the Yamato that the battleship's main battery could not depress low enough to target it. The Yamato turned away to avoid torpedoes, again disrupting the pursuit. The escort carriers, meanwhile, were doing everything possible to survive. They zigzagged constantly to throw off Japanese aim. They steered into rain squalls whenever possible, using the limited visibility to break visual contact. They made smoke continuously, the chemical smoke generators supplemented by every ship burning oil to create thick black clouds that drifted across the battlefield and obscured Japanese range-finding. And most critically, they kept launching aircraft. Every plane that could fly went into the air, even if the pilots had no idea what weapons they were carrying or how to use them against surface ships. By 0750, multiple factors were beginning to affect Japanese perceptions. The Yamato had expended more than 100 of her enormous 18-inch shells at costs of time, fuel, and barrel wear. She had scored no confirmed hits on any American carrier. The heavy cruisers Suzuya and Chikuma had both taken bomb damage from American aircraft. The Kumano was crippled. The destroyers were scattered, trying to screen the capital ships from American torpedo attacks. Most critically, Kurita's fleet was no longer operating as a coordinated force. The order for general attack had devolved into something close to chaos, with individual ships pursuing individual targets based on whoever's commander thought they had the best firing solution. From Kurita's perspective on Yamato's bridge, the battle must have seemed completely surreal. From Kurita's perspective on Yamato's bridge, the battle must have seemed completely surreal. His fleet had been firing continuously for over an hour. They had closed the range considerably. Shell splashes were straddling the American carriers, and yet not a single American flat top had been definitively sunk. The ships kept moving, launching aircraft and making smoke. The destroyers kept attacking with a ferocity that seemed incomprehensible. American pilots were making dummy runs without any ordnance, simply diving at Japanese ships to force them to maneuver and disrupt their gunnery. Some Japanese commanders reported being under attack by dozens of aircraft simultaneously. In reality, Taffy 3's total air complement at the start of the battle was fewer than 150 planes across 6 carriers, and many of those were already damaged or out of fuel. But perception, in the chaos of battle, becomes reality. Japanese lookouts, scanning the skies through anti-aircraft fire and smoke, saw American aircraft everywhere. Not because there were hundreds of them, but because the same planes kept coming back. A pilot would make an attack run, climb back to altitude, circle around, and attack again. And again. And again. Some pilots made more than a dozen, individual runs. They would strafe with machine guns until their ammunition was exhausted, then make dry runs anyway, diving on Japanese ships with empty guns just to force the enemy to take evasive action. When they ran completely out of fuel, they landed on any available carrier, often not their own, refueled and rearmed with whatever weapons were available, and went back up. One pilot from the carrier Gambia Bay, having expended all his ammunition, flew his Wildcat directly at the bridge of a Japanese cruiser in a mock strafing run so aggressive that the cruiser's captain ordered an emergency turn, believing the American intended to crash into him. At 0810, the escort carrier Gambia Bay took her first serious hit. A 14-inch shell from one of the Japanese battleships, probably the Congo, punched through her thin hull plating and detonated inside the engine room. The ship's speed dropped immediately. She began falling behind the other carriers. Like a wounded animal separated from the herd, she became the focus of concentrated Japanese fire. The heavy cruiser Chikuma closed to point-blank range and began systematically pounding the Gambia Bay with 8-inch shells. The escort carrier's single 5-inch stern gun returned fire gamely, but it was hopelessly outmatched. Shells ripped through the Gambia Bay's flight deck, started fires, killed crew members, and destroyed her engineering spaces. By 0850, she was dead in the water, listing heavily, and clearly doomed. The destroyer Johnston, having already expended all her torpedoes in earlier attacks, positioned herself between the crippled Gambier Bay and the Japanese cruisers. Commander Evans, already wounded, his shirt blown off by shrapnel, his left hand shredded, steered his ship with one hand and directed fire with the other. The Johnston engaged 3 Japanese cruisers simultaneously with her 5-inch guns. She scored hits on the Congo. She drew fire away from the Gambier Bay. And, critically, she bought time. Not enough time to save the escort carrier. The Gambier Bay capsized and sank at 0907, the first and only American aircraft carrier, sunk by surface gunfire in the entire war, but enough time for other ships to maneuver, for more aircraft to launch, for the Americans to maintain some semblance of organized resistance. The destroyer Hull, meanwhile, was in her death throes. She had absorbed more than 40 major caliber hits. Her forward engine room was flooded. Her after the engine room was flooding. One of her gun mounts had been blown completely off the ship. She was listing so badly that her crew could barely stand on the deck. And yet she was still fighting. Her surviving 5-inch gun continued to fire at Japanese cruisers until the very end. At 0855, a salvo from Japanese battleships struck the hotel amidships. She rolled over and sank within minutes. Of her crew of 323 men, only 86 survived. The destroyer Escort Samuel B. Roberts, a ship of only 1,350 tons, smaller than many Japanese destroyers, had charged into the battle alongside the larger destroyers. Her crew called her the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, and they earned that title on the morning of October 25th. The Roberts closed to within 4,000 yards of Japanese heavy cruisers, so close that the enemy shells were passing overhead with the sound of freight trains, and launched her 3 torpedoes. At least one struck home, hitting either the heavy cruiser Chokai or Chikuma, and causing serious damage. The Roberts then engaged the cruisers with her 2 5-inch guns, firing so rapidly that her gun crews exhausted the ship's ready ammunition and had to form human chains to pass shells up from the magazines by hand. They fired over 600 rounds in a running battle that lasted nearly an hour. The Japanese cruisers, frustrated and bloodied, turned their full attention to this impudent little ship. Salvos of 8-inch shells walked across the water toward the Roberts. At 0905, the ship took a direct hit in the aft engine room, then another in the forward gun mount, then another amidships, the Samuel B. Roberts lost power, lost steering, lost the ability to fight back. She sank at 0910. Of her crew of 178, 90 died. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But even as these ships died, they accomplished something crucial. They created confusion on a scale that transcended mere tactical uncertainty. The Japanese fleet, which should have been conducting a coordinated destruction of helpless escort carriers, had instead devolved into a sprawling, disorganized melee. Ships were scattered across miles of ocean. Communication between units was breaking down. Smoke from burning ships, chemical smoke screens, and rain squalls reduced visibility to near zero in some areas. Japanese commanders were receiving wildly contradictory reports about the number and type of American ships present. Some claimed to be engaging fleet carriers. Others reported cruisers. Still others insisted they were under attack by battleships, a claim that made no sense. But in the chaos, who could be certain? And critically, the Americans were doing something Japanese doctrine had not anticipated. They were coordinating air attacks from multiple carrier groups. Taffy 2 and Taffy 1, the escort carrier groups to the south, had heard Sprague's desperate calls for help. They began launching their aircraft as well. These planes flew north and joined the battle. Now Japanese ships were dealing not with the roughly 150 aircraft from Taffy 3, but with more than 400 aircraft from all 3 Taffy groups combined. The skies above the Japanese fleet became a hornet's nest of American planes, diving, strafing, dropping whatever ordnance they carried, and, most importantly, forcing every Japanese ship to maneuver constantly to avoid attacks. Maneuvering at high speed under air attack is exhausting for a ship's crew and murderous on mechanical systems. Boilers that had been running at maximum output for hours began to show strain. Fuel consumption, already heavy, became critical. The Japanese ships had not refueled since leaving Brunei days earlier. They had fought their way through American submarine attacks, survived massive airstrikes in the Sibuyan Sea, transited San Bernardino Strait at night, and now were charging at flank speed while under continuous air attack. The fuel gauges were dropping rapidly. At some point soon, Kurita would have to decide whether to continue the attack or withdraw while his ships still had enough fuel to reach port. At 0911, Kurita made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and regroup. The official reason, transmitted to his commanders, was to reform the scattered fleet into a proper battle formation before proceeding to Leyte Gulf. But the order had devastating psychological effects. Ships that were closing in for the kill suddenly reversed course. The pursuit stopped. The American carriers, which had been expecting annihilation within the next 30 minutes, suddenly found themselves with room to breathe. The Japanese fleet, instead of pressing home the attack, began milling about in the waters off Samar, trying to reorganize into some semblance of tactical coherence. Why did Kurita order this? Historians have debated the question for 80 years. Some argue he was simply exhausted. He had been in combat for 3 consecutive days, survived the sinking of 2 flagships, lost the super battleship Musashi, and watched his carefully planned operation descend into chaos. Others point to the conflicting intelligence reports. Kurita may have genuinely believed he was facing a much larger American force than was actually present, and feared sailing into a trap if he pressed further south. Still, others suggest he was concerned about fuel consumption and the long voyage back to Japan. The Japanese Navy had a cultural tendency to preserve the fleet in being rather than risk total destruction, a mindset that dated back to the Battle of Tsushima in 1905. Better to withdraw with most of your fleet intact than lose everything in a Pyrrhic victory. But there's another factor, one that gets less attention but may have been equally important. Kurita had lost confidence in his intelligence picture. He thought he was attacking fleet carriers. But these carriers were too slow. He thought he was facing a limited air threat, but hundreds of aircraft had swarmed his fleet. He thought the Americans would withdraw and avoid a surface engagement. But destroyers had charged his battleships with suicidal courage. Nothing about this battle matched what he had been told to expect. And in the absence of reliable information, caution seemed prudent. If this was just the screening force for a larger American fleet, if Halsey's battleships were nearby and racing south to trap him, if this was all part of an American plan to lure him into a killing zone, then pressing the attack would be exactly the wrong move. During the regroup, which lasted approximately 45 minutes, more American aircraft arrived. These were not from the Taffy groups. These were from Admiral McCain's fast carrier group, part of Halsey's Third Fleet, which had been far to the east when the battle began but had launched a maximum-range strike as soon as they received word of Taffy 3's predicament. McCain's pilots arrived low on fuel, having flown more than 300 miles, but they were equipped with proper anti-ship ordnance, armor-piercing bombs, torpedoes, and rockets. They fell on the Japanese fleet with professional efficiency. The heavy cruiser Suzuya, already damaged by earlier air attacks, took bomb hits that started uncontrollable fires. The crew abandoned the ship. She sank later that afternoon. The heavy cruiser Chikuma took torpedo hits and was left dead in the water. She would be scuttled by Japanese destroyers that evening. At 09:55, with his fleet partially regrouped but still under heavy air attack, still scattered over miles of ocean, still uncertain about what exactly he was facing, Kurita made his final decision. He ordered a complete withdrawal. The fleet would not proceed to Leyte Gulf. It would not attempt to destroy the American amphibious shipping. It would retire through the San Bernardino Strait and return to Brunei. The operation was over. The remaining American ships of Taffy 3, battered and bleeding but still afloat, watched in stunned disbelief as the pagoda masts of the Japanese fleet disappeared over the western horizon. They had survived. Somehow, impossibly, they had survived. The escort carrier Fanshawe Bay had taken 4 major caliber hits but remained operational. The Cullinan Bay had taken 15 hits and near misses but stayed afloat. The White Plains, St. Lo, and Kitkun Bay were all damaged but serviceable. Of the screening vessels, the destroyers Johnston and Hole were gone, along with the destroyer escort Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer Heerman and destroyer escorts Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond were all heavily damaged but survived. The escort carrier Gambia Bay was at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, but they had stopped the Japanese fleet. 6 escort carriers and 7 escorts had turned back 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. They had prevented Kurita from reaching the American amphibious forces at Leyte Gulf, where hundreds of thin-skinned transport ships and tens of thousands of American soldiers would have been completely defenseless. If Kurita had pressed on, if he had ignored the air attacks and destroyer charges and simply steamed past the wreckage of Taffy 3 directly to the invasion beaches, the slaughter would have been catastrophic. The entire Leyte campaign might have been thrown into jeopardy. But he didn't. He withdrew. And the reason he withdrew, the reason he believed he was facing a force far more powerful than 6 escort carriers, was precisely because those escort carriers and their escorts fought with such desperate, unreasoning courage that they convinced him they must be defending something important. The immediate aftermath of the Battle off Samar was chaos. Survivors from the sunken ships, the Gambia Bay, the Johnston, the Hotel, the Samuel B. Roberts, floated in the oil-slicked water for hours, in some cases for days. The sea was warm, which was a mercy, but it was also filled with sharks. Many men died not from their wounds or from drowning, but from shark attacks or simple exhaustion. The rescue operations were hampered by the fact that the American fleet was still expecting Japanese attacks from other directions. Admiral Kinkaid's battleships were refueling and rearming after the night battle in Surigao Strait. Admiral Halsey's carriers were hundreds of miles to the north, chasing the remnants of Ozawa's decoy fleet. It took time, precious time, to organize search and rescue missions. Of the approximately 1,400 men in the water from Taffy 3's sunken ships, roughly 800 survived. 600 did not. The Taffy 3 survivors who remained aboard the ship had barely begun to process what had happened when they faced a new threat. At 10:50 that same morning, a lone Japanese aircraft appeared over the formation. It was a Mitsubishi, a 6M0, and it was flying strangely low, slow, purposefully. The Americans on the escort carrier St. Lo watched it approach with growing dread. They fired everything they had at it: anti-aircraft guns, 5-inch batteries, even small arms. The Zero staggered under the hits, smoke trailing from its engine, but it did not deviate from its course. It crashed directly into the St. Lo's flight deck, penetrated into the hangar bay, and its bomb load detonated among fueled and armed aircraft. The resulting explosion tore through the ship's thin hull. Secondary explosions followed as torpedoes and bombs stored in the hangar cooked off. Within 30 minutes, the St. Lo rolled over and sank, taking more than 100 men with her. She was the first Allied ship sunk by a kamikaze attack, a grim preview of what American sailors would face in the coming months. For the Japanese Navy, the battle off Samar was not perceived as a defeat, not immediately. Kurita's fleet reported sinking multiple American carriers and scoring numerous hits on capital ships. These claims were accepted as fact by Combined Fleet headquarters in Tokyo, at least initially. It was only later, when reconnaissance aircraft and submarine reports failed to confirm the sinkings, when American broadcasts made clear that their invasion of Leyte was proceeding unhindered, that the truth began to emerge. Kurita had not destroyed a fast carrier task group. He had encountered escort carriers, and he had withdrawn without reaching the primary objective. The recriminations were immediate and vicious. Admiral Toyoda Soemu, commander of the Combined Fleet, was reportedly furious. The entire Shogo operation had been predicated on Kurita's center force reaching Leyte Gulf and destroying the American amphibious shipping. Everything else, Ozawa's sacrifice of his carriers in the north, Nishimura's suicidal charge through Surigao Strait. The expenditure of precious fuel oil that Japan could not replace had been in service to that goal. And Kurita had turned back. He had possessed overwhelming firepower. He had faced an enemy so outmatched that their own commander described the situation as like a puppy being smacked by a truck. And yet, he had withdrawn. Kurita's own staff officers were divided. Some supported the decision to withdraw, pointing to the heavy air attacks, the scattered state of the fleet, and the uncertainty about what additional American forces might be nearby. Others argued that the admiral had lost his nerve, that he had failed to press home an attack that could have changed the course of the war. Kurita himself, in post-war interviews, remained defensive about his actions. He insisted that he had made the right decision based on the information available at the time. He pointed out that his fleet had been under continuous attack for 3 days. He noted that fuel was critically low. He emphasized the report's inaccurate reports that suggested he was facing multiple carrier groups, not just Taffy 3. But there was always a note of uncertainty in his explanations, a sense that he himself was not entirely confident in the choice he had made. The battle also revealed fundamental problems with Japanese naval doctrine. The order for general attack, which Kurita had issued at the start of the engagement, was supposed to demonstrate initiative and fighting spirit. Instead, it resulted in tactical chaos. Ships pursued individual targets without coordination. The concentration of fire that should have overwhelmed the American carriers never materialized. Japanese commanders later admitted that better communication and more centralized control might have achieved decisive results despite the American resistance. But the Imperial Japanese Navy's culture emphasized aggressive individual action over coordinated planning. It valued spiritual strength over methodical execution. And on October 25, 1944, that culture produced a Pyrrhic stalemate where total victory had been within reach. For the Americans, the Battle off Samar became an instant legend. Admiral Sprague's after-action report was a masterpiece of understated prose. The enemy ships were so close that it appeared we would be taken under fire by their anti-aircraft batteries at any moment. President Franklin Roosevelt personally awarded Sprague the Navy Cross. Commander Ernest Evans of Johnston was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American naval officer to receive the decoration. The destroyer, Escort Samuel B. Roberts earned the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, and her crew's actions became required reading at the Naval Academy. The pilots of Taffy 3 received distinguished flying crosses and Navy crosses by the dozens. But the deeper significance of the battle lies not in the medals awarded or the ships sunk, but in what it revealed about the nature of naval warfare in 1944. The era of the battleship as the dominant capital ship was over. Not because battleships were ineffective, the Yamato's 18-inch guns were perfectly capable of sinking any ship afloat, but because they could not operate without air superiority. Kurita's fleet possessed overwhelming firepower, but it had been unable to use that firepower effectively because it was under constant air attack. The 400 aircraft from the 3 Taffy groups, armed mostly with inadequate ordnance, had achieved what American battleships and cruisers might not have. They created enough confusion and dealt enough damage to convince Kurita that pressing the attack was too risky. This was the central irony that Kurita discovered off Samar. Material superiority no longer guaranteed victory. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built the Yamato and Musashi to be unsinkable, all-powerful instruments of decisive battle. But decisive battle in the age of carrier warfare did not mean 2 battle lines pounding each other with heavy guns. It meant controlling the airspace above the fleet. And Japan, by October of 1944, no longer possessed the trained pilots, the aircraft production capacity, or the carrier strength to contest American air superiority. Kurita's retreat was not fundamentally a failure of courage or even of tactical judgment. It was an acknowledgement, perhaps unconscious, that the kind of war he had trained for no longer existed. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. The Japanese Navy entered the war with approximately 2,000 trained carrier pilots. By late 1944, most were dead. The training program could not replace them. Japanese naval aviators by this point in the war often had fewer than 100 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. American pilots typically had more than 300 hours, plus combat experience. Japanese aircraft production in 1944 totaled approximately 28,000 planes. American aircraft production that same year exceeded 96,000. Japan's industrial capacity was roughly 10% of America's. Every ship sunk, every plane shot down, every trained pilot killed was a loss that Japan could not afford and could not replace. The United States, by contrast, was launching a new Essex-class fleet carrier every month. The mathematics of attrition warfare were inexorable. Kurita saw 300 to 400 aircraft swarming his fleet off Samar and drew the obvious conclusion: this must be a major American carrier force. What he did not understand, what he could not understand without access to the larger strategic picture, was that these were not fleet carriers, and that the Americans could afford to throw escort carriers into a surface battle because they had dozens of fleet carriers elsewhere. The Japanese Navy was fighting with resources it had accumulated before the war and could not replace. The American Navy was fighting with resources it was producing faster than they could be consumed. That gap, more than any single battle or tactical decision, determined the outcome of the Pacific War. The battle off Samar cost the Japanese Navy 3 heavy cruisers sunk and 3 more damaged. It cost them approximately 1,000 men killed. More importantly, it cost them the last realistic chance to disrupt American operations in the Philippines. After Leyte Gulf, the Imperial Japanese Navy never again sortied in force. The remaining battleships and carriers stayed in port, hoarding dwindling fuel supplies, waiting for opportunities that never came. The Yamato herself would make one final voyage in April of 1945, sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa, with only enough fuel for a single leg of the journey. American carrier aircraft found her and sank her long before she reached her destination. Of her crew of over 2,700 men, fewer than 300 survived. For Taffy 3, the cost was steep but not catastrophic. 1 escort carrier and 3 escorts sunk. Approximately 1,000 men were killed. But the American industrial machine replaced those losses within months. New escort carriers slid down the ways at shipyards in Oregon and Washington. New destroyer escorts were commissioned on the East Coast. The crews of the sunken ships who survived were given leave, reassigned to new vessels, and returned to the war. By early 1945, Taffy 3 had been reconstituted with replacement ships and was back on station, providing air support for subsequent amphibious operations. The human cost, of course, cannot be measured in replacement schedules. The men who died in the water off Samar burned, drowned, or torn apart by sharks did not care about industrial production statistics. The families who received telegrams informing them of deaths in action found no comfort in strategic analyses. Commander Ernest Evans, last seen on the bridge of the sinking Johnston, shouting orders to abandon ship even as Japanese cruisers continued to fire at his crippled destroyer, became a hero to his crew but remained dead. The 89 men of the Samuel B. Roberts, who went down with their ship, earned posthumous fame but no second chances. And yet, their sacrifice was not meaningless. The soldiers of the 6th Army, landing on the beaches of Leyte, never knew how close they came to disaster. If Kurita had pressed on, if he had reached the invasion beaches with 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers, the slaughter would have been immense. Thin-skinned transport ships, LSTs loaded with supplies, destroyer transports packed with troops, all would have been helpless against 18-inch guns. The entire American timetable for the reconquest of the Philippines would have been thrown into chaos. General MacArthur's promise to return might have become a bitter joke. The war might have been prolonged by months, even years. But that did not happen. It did not happen because 6 escort carriers and 7 screening vessels fought a battle they could not win and somehow won it anyway. Not by sinking the Japanese fleet, they didn't. Not by inflicting crippling damage, they didn't. But by creating enough confusion, enough chaos, enough doubt that the Japanese commander blinked. And in that moment of hesitation, in that decision to regroup and withdraw, the outcome of the Battle of Leyte Gulf was decided. Admiral Kurita retired from active service after the war. He lived until 1977, long enough to see Japan rebuild and prosper, long enough to read the accounts of American historians who condemned his decision to withdraw. He never publicly admitted that he had made the wrong choice, but neither did he ever claim that he had made the right one. He simply maintained that he had done what seemed best at the time with the information available in the chaos of battle. Perhaps that is all any commander can do. The Battle off Samar remains one of the most studied naval engagements of World War II precisely because it defies easy categorization. It was a tactical defeat for the Americans. They lost more ships and more men. It was a strategic victory for the Americans. They prevented the Japanese from reaching their objective. It was a demonstration of courage that borders on the unbelievable. It was also a demonstration of how confusion and incomplete information can paralyze decision-making, even when material superiority seems overwhelming. Most of all, it was proof that in the final analysis, wars are not won by the quality of individual ships or the courage of individual sailors, but by the industrial and logistical capacity to replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. The Japanese fleet that steamed away from Samar on the morning of October 25th was still powerful. It still possessed battleships and cruisers that could destroy any surface force they encountered, but it had lost something more important than ships or sailors. It had lost the psychological initiative. It had encountered an enemy that refused to accept inevitable defeat, and that refusal had been enough to turn back a fleet. That lesson that material superiority alone does not guarantee victory if the enemy refuses to acknowledge it is one that military commanders have had to relearn in every subsequent conflict. The Americans off Samar did not know they were outgunned. Or rather, they knew it, they acknowledged it, and they fought anyway. And sometimes, in the terrible mathematics of war, that makes all the difference. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.